Welcome to Canada's most irreverent talk show. This is the Andrew Lawton Show, brought to you by True North.
Hello and welcome to you all, the Andrew Lawton Show on True North. It is Tuesday, June 11th, 2024. Great to have you tuned in here. And if you've used Twitter or X as they call it now, you'll notice it's changed a lot in the last few months since the Elon Musk takeover. Now, some of the changes are good. I'm not worried about being censored or throttled or anything like that. But the algorithms are a little bit weird, yet oddly mesmerizing in the same way. So I was just looking at Twitter. I try to get, my finger on the pulse of things before the show begins. And I'm seeing some video clip. The caption is, "She cheated on him and was using him for the game, so he decided to smash the ball and take all the money, leaving her with nothing." And it's a 35-second clip from some reality game dating type show that I've never heard of with people I've never heard of. And I have no interest in, and I don't follow the account that posted it. But by George, I watched that whole clip as though I was just entranced and engrossed in it. So the algorithm's doing something right, and I lost 35 seconds of my life that I'll never get back, which I have tried to get back by making you deal with 35 seconds of your life as I tell you the story. But in any event, yesterday we had not a wardrobe malfunction, but a caffeine malfunction on the show. So I made sure to drink half of my coffee today before it got into the studio. So hopefully I don't spill this all over as I did yesterday. But fortunately, no equipment was harmed in the making of this show. I can't say the same for Justin Trudeau's polling numbers, which have been incredibly, and it would appear irreparably harmed in recent months in particular, where the Conservatives look to have at some points a 20-point lead over the Liberals. And some polls, the NDP could even be there for second place, and the Liberals would be relegated to being the third party, as they were previously before Justin Trudeau took the helm. But it's interesting when you talk about all of this, when you talk about all of what's happening to Justin Trudeau, there is a part that's missing, which is that he never wants to acknowledge his own part. Has never wanted to acknowledge his own part in why he is so unpopular. And we don't do the whole horse race thing on the show where every day I say, oh, this poll has someone up 2 or down 1 or up 3. But you have to talk about the big trends. And when the polls are not moving, when Justin Trudeau continues to be flagging and he continues to be not able to resonate with voters, there is something there that is not just an anomaly that you can pin down on the Nanos methodology or the Angus Reid methodology. It's every poll by every pollster. The only thing that changes is the margin. So what does Justin Trudeau think is the big issue facing democracy today? Take a look.
Around the world, a rise of populist right-wing forces in just about every democracy that we've seen. And it is of concern to see political parties choosing to instrumentalize anger, fear, division, anxiety. My approach has always been to respond to it, to understand it, and to look to solve it, to roll up our sleeves, work hard, and with ambition for this country and for our future. And I continue to be convinced that Canadians are thoughtful about the challenges we're facing and ready to see them solved, rather than just allow themselves to be have their anger amplified without any solutions offered.
Oh, the rise of far-right populist forces. Now, there are probably some voters that are saying, absolutely, it's about darn time. But Justin Trudeau's view is that this is the menace to democracy. Now, there are a few things here. Number one is what he's calling far-right and populist. Now, I can't separate these comments from the context this week of the EU elections, in which a lot of right-wing parties had tremendous success, so much so that there's been a lot of finger-wagging from many people on the left about what's happening. But the part of democracy that people don't like is that sometimes you lose and sometimes other parties win. And when other parties win, you shouldn't look at it as some terrible ordeal. You should look at it as a victory because voters had to decide. And clearly what this other group was talking about mattered more to people and offered more solutions than what you were offering. But this is where I bring it back into a Canadian context. Justin Trudeau complaining about far-right populist forces means that he's trying to say that when Pierre Poilievre is doing well in the polls, and again, if they keep up, if he wins against Justin Trudeau, that what's happening there is actually bigger. It's just a part of some global right-wing, evil, scary populist wave. It's nothing to do with Justin Trudeau, nothing to do with Pierre Poilievre. There's just a global force. All the people that went to the polls were motivated by what happened in Europe. They're motivated by Trump. They're motivated by Orban. And they just decided, yeah, I'm going to vote for this, Pierre Poilievre. I've never heard of him, but I'm just going to vote for him anyway. It doesn't really work like that. It doesn't work like that at all. So when Justin Trudeau gets up there and says that all of these things are part of this global trend, he's trying to say that it's not his fault. He's trying to tell his own people, no. Populism is the problem, not me. Blame the right, blame the populists, blame Trump, blame Poilievre, blame everything. Don't blame me. When the reality is, it's Justin Trudeau that's been presiding over this country for the last 10 years. If things have gotten so bad that there is this anger, that there is this, and Chrystia Freeland even recognized this yesterday, this burning wrath by average people, that's the government's fault. That's the government's fault because the government has allowed things to get that bad in the country that people feel that. But even if you were to say that all of this was a big global trend, it has nothing to do with Trudeau, even if you were to accept that point, do you honestly believe Justin Trudeau's second part of that line, which is that he has only brought understanding and solutions? Understanding and solutions. So when people feel alienated and disconnected, he has just brought understanding and solutions. It's not like he's ever called a group a fringe minority or anything, right?
To underline that close to 90% of truckers in this country are vaccinated, like close to 90% of Canadians. Over the past many months and years now, Canadians have stepped up to protect each other, to protect our frontline workers, to protect our elders, to protect our young people, to protect people like truckers who are putting food on our grocery store shelves. Canadians have stepped up to do the right thing, to protect the freedoms and the rights of Canadians to get back to the things we love to do. We know the way through this pandemic is by getting everyone vaccinated. And the overwhelming majority, close to 90% of Canadians, have done exactly that. The small fringe minority of people who are on their way to Ottawa or who are holding unacceptable views that they're expressing do not represent the views of Canadians who have been there for each other, who know that following the science and stepping up to protect each other is the best way to continue to ensure our freedoms, our rights, our values as a country.
That didn't sound like understanding or solutions to me. Maybe it was a one-off. Maybe when he's talking in French, he comes across as more understanding and solution-oriented.
On va s'en sortir de cette pandémie par la vaccination. Puis on en connaît tous des gens qui sont en train d'hésiter un petit peu. On va continuer d'essayer de les convaincre. Mais il y a aussi des gens qui sont farouchement opposés à la vaccination.
Qui sont extrémistes.
Qui croient pas dans la science, qui sont souvent misogynes, souvent racistes aussi. C'est un petit groupe, mais qui prend de la place. Et là, il faut faire un choix en tant que leader, en tant que pays. Est-ce qu'on tolère ces gens-là ou est-ce qu'on dit, voyons, la plupart des gens, presque 80% des Québécois ont fait ce qu'il fallait faire, se sont fait vacciner, on veut revenir aux choses qu'on aime faire. C'est pas ces gens-là qui vont nous bloquer maintenant.
Oh, weird. Okay. People who don't get vaccinated, who are against vaccines, they're in two categories. One is, well, maybe we can convince them and persuade them. But if we can't do that, if they really don't want to get vaccinated, they're misogynist, they're extremist, they're racist, they're all of this. So again, I'm not hearing this commitment to understanding, this commitment to solutions, this rise against the anger, this rise above the anger. I'm not hearing it. Maybe I've been wrong. I know he's done some gaslighting on this in the past when Eva Chipiuk, the lawyer representing the organizers of the convoy, was cross-examining Trudeau during the Public Order Emergency Commission. What did he say? Oh, I never called the unvaccinated names. No, sirree. Gambling in this establishment never happened. I'm squinting because I'm just so frustrated by a lot of this. But it's easy and almost hilarious when he gets up there and says populism is the problem. The far-right forces are the problem. He's trying to say that he is not. And I realize that the Liberal Party does not have a lot of options. The Liberal Party, if its members, if its caucus members were to want to get rid of Justin Trudeau, they don't really have a mechanism to do so. The Conservatives decided to activate this section of what's called the Reform Act, where caucus members can vote to get rid of their leader, like Aaron O'Toole did, had happened to him. He didn't really do it. He was not too keen on that. But the Liberals don't, and it won't be until they have an election lost that they'll really have a leadership review. So there are always rumors swirling. I saw some by a journalist this week saying, oh, yes, Justin Trudeau is going to resign this summer. Maybe he doesn't. Maybe he does. Doesn't really matter. If you're Mark Carney and you're waiting in the wings, you probably want Justin Trudeau to go completely over the cliff and drive your party into collapse. And then you come, because whoever leads the Liberal Party into the next election is going to be a sacrificial lamb. So you want like an interim leader so that the party just accepts, yeah, this isn't going to happen. We'll take our lumps. We'll get our floggings, our lashings out of the way. And then the new leader will come in. And that's kind of what happened with Justin Trudeau. Post Michael Ignatieff. But all of this is besides the point in some ways, because right now you do have an anger and a frustration in Canadians. And there is a lot of victim blaming going on whenever this is brought up. We spoke about this in the context of media, where people look at the decline of trust in the media and they start blaming the people who distrust the media instead of blaming the media and saying, well, what has the media done to deserve this or not deserve this? How can the media regain trust? People like Justin Trudeau look at his declining fortunes in politics, and instead of saying, maybe I'm not the guy that Canadians want right now, they say something along the lines of, Canadians are being co-opted. Remember the million-person march? When you had, in a lot of cases, Muslim families standing up and saying, we do not like our kids being taught a lot of this over-the-top pride stuff. And what did Justin Trudeau say? Well, these are just people being co-opted by the far right in America. Because the idea that, maybe this group that he has tried to claim as his own political coalition has not exactly fallen in love with what he's done as Prime Minister. So right here you have, again, this idea that we should look at everything other than the perpetrators, everything other than the people who are genuinely to blame for why no one likes them, why no one is too keen on them. And again, you got to commit to the bit. Remember last week when Jennifer O'Connell, that Liberal member of Parliament, said, boo-hoo, get over it, in the House of Commons committee room, because the Conservatives were talking about foreign interference. They were talking about foreign operatives that were collaborating wittingly with Canadian members of Parliament and senators. And she was just saying, boo-hoo, get over it. And it became this thing where she tried to, do the whole, who are you going to believe, you or me or your lying eyes sort of thing. And she's continued to double down on this. So Frank Caputo has announced a motion that he wants to have voted on. Now, I think a lot of this is theatrics, but you can see the motion on your screen here. He basically said that she needs to apologize for her comments. Now, Jennifer O'Connell has come out and said this, which I find hilarious. Frank was hurt. I interrupted him. Only brought up heckling, not the very real issues of foreign interference. Thin-skinned CPC MPs whining I expose their hypocrisy. They lie about me because I tell the truth about them. Looking forward to tomorrow. Bring it on. So, Pierre Poilievre has Bring It Home. Jennifer O'Connell has Bring It On. Actually, a funny story. I think this is a funny enough story. I don't think I'm out of line for telling it. So I ran into last week, or no, it was a few weeks ago. I was covering a rally that Poilievre was holding in Etobicoke. And Adam Chambers, who was on the show last week, I ran into him, and he was there with his young child. And his young child, and Pierre's whole thing is, bring it home. That's the tagline. And the child was like just tired of the rally at this point and said, I want to go home. I want to go home. And Adam said, no, bring it home. Bring it home. It was a rather cute moment that I'm sure the Liberals or NDP would turn into something else. But all of this is, I think, interesting right now because we are seeing this Liberal disarray. We're seeing the Liberals right now really not know what to do. And if you're a backbench Liberal member of Parliament, you're finding yourself at risk of losing your seat. If you're a Liberal in the GTA that was elected in 2015, if you're a Liberal in parts of Vancouver and British Columbia, you are right now facing a very real loss that is preventable in a way, that would be preventable if their party did not actually have the record it had and was so unapologetic and so unrepentant. And that, I think, is where we are really seeing the negativity going to come out in full force. This is why the Liberals are doubling down on the abortion narrative. It's why they're doubling down. We're going to have Assault Rifle Day pretty soon, where the Liberals are going to be talking about all sorts of stuff that no one else but them is talking about. They're going to be introducing debates that no one is having. And in the past, they've had success with this. You can't deny that it has been an effective tactic at times, but I don't think it's going to give them as much success this time. I don't think it's going to give them as much success this time. Simply put, because we are seeing the Canadians are seeing through it. We're seeing that Canadians are just not buying it right now. And Poilievre has, because I've done so many interviews. Funnily enough, my book came out 2 weeks ago. Last week and the week before, I just did this marathon of interviews, including, by the way, I should own up to this. So I've done, I think, 31 interviews with CBC. So I did one on power and politics. Am I 31 or 29? So I was 31 or 29, but I did an interview with Power and Politics. I did one yesterday with CBC Ottawa, and I did another one with CBC's The House with Catherine Cullen, which came out on the weekend. But then you do this thing where I've never done it before, but I've heard about it, where you basically just lock yourself in a room and you do back-to-back 10-minute interviews with every CBC radio market in the country, basically. And they all ask the same questions, basically. One of them, every now and then one might like freelance a bit or go rogue. But so by the end of it, your answer has totally changed from the first one just because you got bored of giving the first one. But you do this, and it was like a 3-hour interval on one day and a 3-hour interval on the next day of just nonstop CBC interviews. So it's a lot of fun. They're interested in Pierre Poilievre. They're interested in covering my book about him, which you can get. It's behind my shoulder there. You can't have that one, but it is on Amazon. It's on the Toronto Star's bestseller list, the Globe and Mail bestseller list. You can get it at Indigo. But the reason I'm bringing this up right now is because CBC has an interest in Pierre Poilievre. The Toronto Star has run 3 or 4 stories about my book. They have an interest in it. So I think you have people that are on the political left or editorially aligned to the political left that right now are realizing maybe, just maybe, we can't treat this guy the same as every other conservative leader. Maybe, just maybe, he's not actually the guy that we've been trying to make him out to be. Now, some of these people are reaching this conclusion honestly. They're reaching the conclusion because they realize that, okay, people are more complex. We don't want to turn him into a caricature. It's not fitting of democracy. Other people are just realizing, okay, what we're doing now isn't working. And by the way, I know people all the time will say that this is a pro-Poilievre show. It's not. I've made criticisms of him. I've said things that are supportive of him. My book does both sides, which I think is why CBC has found so much in there that it wants to talk about. I lamented the other day that Mark Miller, the immigration minister, had approvingly tweeted out an excerpt of my book. So clearly the Liberals have found something in there. But you need to be able to have these discussions. And right now, the Conservatives are providing the most viable alternative to the Liberals, the most electorally viable alternative to the Liberals. So you have to look at this contrast and take it at face value in a lot of ways. And what it means, what it's likely to look like, is where there's some speculation and debate. And I won't claim to be able to authoritatively say what a Poilievre government would do if he's elected. But I can look at the track records of Trudeau versus Poilievre just in the last year. And I can look at all of this and say that right now there are 2 discussions taking place. There are 2 discussions. I'm going to have an interview later this week with John Rustad, who's the leader of the BC Conservatives. And the left has always said that in BC, everyone is just left wing. But that's not actually the case. It's not actually all that true. And I think the fact that we're seeing in BC the Conservatives do so well right now in the polls, similarly to the federal Conservatives, although not quite that dramatically, is, I think, a sign of this. And one of the reasons BC is important to look at is because you've seen a significant divide in the way that province has dealt with drug policy. And this has been an area where even the NDP government there has reversed itself. But this is not exclusively a British Columbia problem. Many of you may know I live in London, Ontario. And my city, very quickly, I saw about a decade ago, maybe 8 years ago or so, started to become just as notable on the drug issue as many other communities. And you had these weird pockets where you'd look at, Vancouver and London. And I never quite understood why that was, why London had become this hotbed for it. And there are political reasons for this as well, in terms of how London has chosen to deal with this issue over time. And some of these have come to a bit of a flashpoint in recent months as we've seen the debate wage on. And one of the former advocates for what's called safe supply has become one of its most prominent critics right now. She was on the show in the past on a panel we did exploring a lot of these issues, and I wanted to bring her back on now, as she had a fantastic piece in the National Post this week looking at London as a case study here. Dr. Sharon Koivu is an addiction medicine physician and joins me now. Dr. Koivu, good to talk to you again. Thanks for coming on today.
Thank you very much for having me.
So just to start with London here for a moment, because this is my own community, it's my own city, and I've spoken to so many people who have just refused to go to town. They've refused to go to parts of it. They've talked about feeling unsafe. So we have this issue here in the city, and I know that for you, you've seen this very closely over the course of your career. But why has London become so unique in some ways?
I think that's a very good question, and it's a somewhat complicated answer, but I'm going to try to give a quick answer. London was a place that had a significant problem with opioid use during what I would refer to as the Purdue-driven opioid crisis, when we had a lot of use with OxyContin. We had a lot of prescribing of opioids. That switched to a drug called hydromorphcontin when OxyContin was taken off the market. When that happened, we had a problem with people injecting hydromorphcontin, which led to problems with a heart valve infection and HIV becoming a problem in London. And we tried to fix that problem by putting more drugs at it, by giving out Dilaudid, which is the same drug as hydromorphcontin, and to people who were high risk, who were sex workers particularly. We fixed we really helped the problem we were aiming for, which was to reduce the heart valve infection and HIV. But we've kind of been playing whack-a-mole, and we've been trying to fix things with more opioids. And with doing this, we've created more problems. So we now have a program in London that gives out large quantities of opioids that aren't witnessed, refer to it as safe. And I think it's really important to remember prescription opioids got us into the problem we're in. Opioids aren't safe. They are toxic. Illicit fentanyl is toxic. Hydromorphone is toxic. And now we've increased the availability of opioids on the streets of London. And we did it in a way that most people weren't even aware. I was very involved in the town hall meetings on the supervised consumption sites. So people knew that we were going to be having supervised consumption sites. People weren't aware of the sort of giving the safe supply program, where we're giving out large amounts of opioids to people, and really weren't able to understand some of the side effects that they were seeing from that. I think some of them they blamed the supervised injection site on, but by doing that, we've really increased the amount of opioids on the street. We've decreased the price of opioids on the street, and we've essentially flooded London with opioids, which has also led to an increase. As people become addicted to one thing, they seek something stronger. It's kind of driven people to sell their drugs in exchange for fentanyl. It's helped drive the fentanyl crisis. So we particularly have driven that in London, and we can see that London is different. So we have a program that's different, and London's was similar to Ontario for our overdose deaths, our emerge visits, for example. And since the program has started, we've actually gone up and up and up. We are much higher in our overdose deaths than the general population of Ontario, and significantly higher in our emergency department visits, and certainly in what I see in the hospital with infections related to injection drug use, particularly dilaudid use. So we've created a problem that is worse in London because of what we were trying to fix in the first place.
So you raise an important point there, Dr. Koivu, in that there's a knee-jerk reaction and I think a moral argument that often gets made about drugs. But if we want to restrict this just to the science and to the data, we now have 8 years of data on this, and we've seen, as you know, more infections, more patient deaths. We certainly see diversion, and I think some people try to downplay that, but we know it exists. So how do the advocates of safe supply account for that? Because they are convinced, or at least they claim to be convinced, that the data are on their side.
I think that I don't have complete control of how they use their data.
But you hear the arguments.
Oh, I hear the arguments. And I guess what I'd say is something working doesn't mean that its side effects aren't bad. And one of the things I'd like to compare this to is actually if you're just looking at if something works. So if you're looking at nausea of pregnancy, for example, and being nauseated in pregnancy can be quite serious. It can cause problems to the mother, problems to the fetus. So a good treatment is important. If you're just looking at benefits, thalidomide is probably one of the best drugs to take to help get rid of nausea of pregnancy. But it has significant side effects to the fetus if it's taken in the first trimester and can cause a decrease in the limbs. So seeing a benefit doesn't mean that the side effects don't outweigh the benefits. So when people are saying they see a benefit, they may be. But I also would say we don't know for sure what the benefits are from. So when we started this program, we've also got people into primary care. We know primary care is important. Wound care, HIV care, wraparound services, housing first programs. Just engaging in a program increases people's ability to stabilize. And we didn't really look at what part of the program was actually effective. So I'm sure that people are seeing, for some individuals in the program, they feel that they're benefiting, but some of that benefit would have been from the other parts of the program, and they didn't compare it to other programs that are so much safer, like opioid agonist therapy programs, and getting people into on something like buprenorphine.
We've briefly lost Dr. Sharon Koivu. We'll work to get her back on the line in just a moment here. It's quite fascinating to me. And, again, I understand the emotionally charged arguments on this. I do. I understand why people are getting very frightened because, again, there's an inherent absurdity to let's give people suffering with drug addiction drugs and, think that that's going to work. And but even if you overcome that and you don't care about that argument and you move beyond that, it's not doing what it's supposed to do. It's not actually turning this thing, which is inherently unsafe, into something that is safe. And this was an issue that was raised back when needle dispensaries and crack pipe dispensaries were becoming a thing. And I remember this in London probably 8 years ago or so, and it's happened elsewhere. And you'd look at this and say, drugs are not unsafe just because of the delivery mechanism. They're not just unsafe because people might reuse a needle. They are unsafe because drugs are unsafe. And drugs, certainly of these varieties, are incredibly, incredibly dangerous to people. So I'm looking at this, and I'm seeing this big divide between the so-called expert class and where a lot of ordinary Canadians are. And I was actually at a social event. Believe it or not, I get invited to those like once every 3 or 4 years. I was at a social event not that long ago, and I was talking to someone very, very anti-conservative. Did not like Poilievre, didn't like Danielle Smith, didn't like the right, probably doesn't like me. But anyway, and this person had said, well, the one thing I'll say about Danielle Smith, I love what she's doing on drugs. I love that she's, going to force people into treatment. Because this was an issue that transcended the left-right divide. It transcended that. And this was someone who actually found that this was a policy because, again, they're looking in their community and they're seeing what so many others in this country are seeing. And they're wondering why no one's doing anything about it. So when you hear, and I would encourage you to go back and look at my panel discussion that I had on this show with Sharon Koivu and Julian Summers, Dr. Julian Summers, who's a psychologist, and Adam Zivo, the journalist with the National Post. And we talked about this. We talked about it from a number of different angles. And what's notable about Drs. Koivu and Summers is that they were advocates for this. They were not just ideologues. They were advocates for this who saw the data, who saw the research, and then from there realized that, okay, this isn't actually working. This is not doing what we thought it was going to do at best, and at worst, it's making things far worse. So we have to move on in a couple of moments, but we do have Dr. Koivu back on now. So I want to just at least get one or two more questions here before we talk about LNG, which is a far less controversial issue. Dr. Koivu, thank you for reconnecting here. Let me just ask you, as we kind of look at the way forward on this, there are people that, like I said, are against harm reduction in general. The people that would not like supervised injection sites, that wouldn't like needle dispensaries and all of that. Where do you think is the optimal point at the harm reduction that works versus the harm reduction that doesn't?
I think, speaking specifically about harm reduction by definition can't harm others. So if it's reducing harm, it's really important that it doesn't harm the community and certainly not other people. So I think we really have to be aware of harm reduction. But I also think when I started in addiction work, we talked about the 4 pillars: prevention, treatment, harm reduction, and enforcement. And like anything where you have a structure, if you only have one pillar, things fall down. And putting all of your emphasis on harm reduction at the expense of prevention and treatment and even enforcement, we lose the ability to really get a complete comprehensive approach for people. We need prevention, but we also know prevention includes about accessibility. When things are very accessible, cheap, easy to access, you have an increase of people using them. We need to decrease access to opioids. We knew that during the opioid crisis. We also need to look at social determinants of health and trauma and really be working to have mental health care and services to help prevent people from getting into a problem with addiction. We need to have treatment, and that treatment needs to include things that are proven, such as opioid agonist treatment, as well as other options for people. In harm reduction, I think we have to go back and look at supervised injection sites. I do think they have merit, but they were meant to help engage people, get them into care, connect them with resources, and help people do motivational interviewing to get into a recovery program. But extremely important that a supervised injection site engages with the community that they were in and works to ensure that they're a safe place to be for that community and do not add harm to the community. I think that's extremely important. And enforcement, sometimes I do not feel people should be criminalized for their addiction, which is a mental health issue. But I think the importance of enforcement in helping to work with communities, even helping to engage people into recovery, is something that we are now really overlooking. So we need to be balancing all of those pillars and make sure we provide appropriate medical treatment for a medical illness, engage the community, and make sure that while we're doing this, we aren't making things worse for individuals and for society.
Dr. Sharon Koivu's op-ed in the National Post, quote unquote, safe supply has only worsened the addiction crisis in London. And I note that safe supply is always in quotation marks throughout your piece, which I think is a very important bit of punctuation there for the discussion at hand. Dr. Koivu, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you for having me.
We'll certainly talk about this in further detail in the future. I know it's an incredibly important subject, and it's one that's ravaging individuals and communities alike. And I think we are seeing the tide turning on this, but you certainly have this small group of very loud activist types that, Dr. Koivu is very diplomatic in the way she speaks. Adam Zivo is diplomatic, but a little less so. He shoots from the hip a bit more because he's, he's in the business of delving in to these groups in a way that, he doesn't have the patient load to deal with. But I think it's fascinating to me to see this discussion and to see it turning. But still, the status quo is it's remaining the status quo in a lot of ways. So we'll move on to another subject here. I said we talk about LNG. So this has become a bit of a hobby horse for me, because I love when you have, on one hand, Justin Trudeau will get up there and say there's no business case for LNG export. And then, as I've joked in the past, and it keeps happening, Vassy Kapelos will interview all these foreign heads of government and heads of state that come to Canada, like the Prime Minister of Greece and it was the Prime Minister or President of Spain and the Chancellor of Germany, and, ask all of them about LNG. And they're all like, oh yeah, we'd love to buy Canadian LNG. So there is actually a market. There is a business case. One of the holdups, though, has always been the limitation of refineries and export terminals. Well, we have an export terminal at long last nearing completion in British Columbia. So I think it's time to have a bigger picture discussion about the future of LNG. Philip Cross is back. It's been a little while, but it's always good to have him on the show. He is a senior fellow with both the Fraser Institute and Macdonald-Laurier Institute, and had an interesting piece about this in the Financial Post. The figures show Canada needs more LNG projects. Philip, always good to talk to you. Thanks for coming on today.
My pleasure, Andrew. Thanks for having me back.
So where does this argument that there's no business case come from? Because every time you see people lining up to buy it, that strikes me as a pretty compelling business case.
Well, it certainly doesn't come from the business community. And as you noted, it doesn't come from our potential customers overseas who were very anxious to access Canadian LNG. The idea that it's not economic only seems to occur in the head of our Prime Minister and perhaps some bureaucrats who don't know anything about business cases. But clearly there isn't just a business case, there is an outstanding business case. It's been proven by the Americans who built any number of LNG terminals and made a fortune exporting from them to Europe at the peak of when LNG prices hit extremely high levels just after Putin's invasion of Russia. But there also are opportunities in Asia, and that's the main advantage is we're going to get a higher price for a product we're already producing. Instead of selling it for a very low price to the United States, we can access prices overseas. So it's not even clear that it's going to have a major impact on emissions or any of that.
Yeah, and what's interesting too is that when Canada exports LNG or Canadian oil and gas in general, it allows other countries that are not as quote unquote green, realizing that's a loading term, to have an alternative to, say, coal. And one of the things that has always been missing from this discussion from a lot of people is that emissions are a global calculation, not a domestic one. Mm-hmm. So and I've heard Michael Binion of the Modern Miracle Network make this point that, we could increase emissions in Canada and have a net reduction of emissions globally if we allow Canadian energy, which is produced with very high standards, to access the international market. But that part's missing. And there's so many barriers that are put up really by ideology towards Canada being a major player on this market, it seems.
Yeah, I can't agree with you more about the global emissions. I mean, I have to laugh. I heard on the local radio station this morning driving into Ottawa that Ottawa is finally conceding that it's not going to achieve its target of a 43% reduction in emissions. Well, my goodness, I can't imagine anything more pointless than calculating the emissions at the local level.
Global warming in the city boundaries of Ottawa is going to be one way, and then once you get out, it'll be different. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's a purely theoretical calculation, anyways, even at the national level. In fact, I'll be writing about this in an upcoming op-ed in the Post about how, when we measure emissions, there isn't somebody from Stackhand doesn't go outside and measure something or stand on top of the Coates building and start measuring emissions. It's a theoretical calculation. Emissions in this country, for example, blew through the roof last year when we had all those forest fires, and yet that doesn't enter into the official calculation. So the whole business of calculating emissions is very vague and model based at the best of times. But the broad lines are that we can be sure that LNG from BC is going to have lower emissions than coal being burned in China. So if emissions are your only focus, it's still a no-brainer.
How much does, I mean, if it's possible to even quantify, but how much does investor confidence and investor tolerance wane on these sorts of projects when you see activists that in some cases very successfully disrupt these things? Because I know there have been a couple of isolated examples where companies have said, listen, this just isn't worth the hassle anymore.
Well, they certainly have had an impact. I mean, Kinder Morgan got out of the oil pipeline business for Trans Mountain because the fears about the delays. I was just reading the Stephen Mayer's book about Justin Trudeau, in which he talks about how Premier Horgan out in BC, he wasn't that opposed to pipelines. He certainly wasn't opposed at all to LNG. He let that one go ahead. But he was just worried. He wanted to keep his coalition together, and he was worried about environmental activists disrupting the work sites and embarrassing the government. So, the militant environmentalists do have an impact and have a disproportionate and excessive voice in determining whether these projects go ahead or not.
So what's happening now? Because you noted that there's already been, since the I think it was the Kitimat project was basically nearing completion, that there's already been a bit of a resurgence in discussions about others.
Well, and not just because we've finally completed one in Canada. I mean, only in Canada.
It took us way longer than it should have.
One project, and let's break out the champagne. But it's a combination of a project finally being completed here in Canada, but at the same time, the Biden administration has given in to their environmental lobbyists and have temporarily frozen any issue of permits for any new projects. Now, there's several projects already underway in the U.S. that will continue to go ahead. So it's not like there's a moratorium, like they imposed on the Keystone Pipeline. But nevertheless, it's an indication that particularly if Biden should get reelected and next year or later this year, and then doesn't care about getting reelected again, and therefore gives into the environmental lobby even more, that there may be a real opportunity for Canada to gain back some of the very large amount of market share that we've lost to the U.S. in developing LNG up to now. So, but these projects take decades to get the permitting and the building done. So it's something we have to start on right now. We can't wait for another administration in the U.S. to come and go before we decide, maybe there's a market here. I think what happened in Europe, with the German chancellor and so on, coming over here in a panic shows that, you have to have that capacity ready well ahead of emergencies. You never know when emergencies are going to come along or when extraordinary events will happen. And so it's best to have the capacity in place and be ready for them.
Yeah, and one of the biggest, I think, counterpoints when Olaf Scholz, so I think, triggered the discussion of this, certainly from the perspective of the business case aspect of it. When that came up, one of the arguments that was made by critics of Canadian LNG or of expanding it was, well, yeah, I mean, if we started it, way back, sure, but the whole point is we couldn't do anything now to serve what he's wanting now. So when you hear that argument happening, it's like, well, great. Well, that means, the best time was yesterday, but the second best time is today.
Yeah, and at one point, when LNG Canada finally went ahead, it was part and parcel of what were at the time 20 project proposals. Now, some of them were just never going to go, were just flyers. But clearly there was serious commercial interest in developing several of them. And some of them needed to be in the East Coast to access the European markets. Most of the discussion now is on the West Coast to access Asian markets. We should diversify. I mean, the important thing to understand in all of this is that right now we are landlocked into just the U.S. market for basically all of our oil and gas. We have to, and as a result, the Americans, not being stupid, pay us very low prices, knowing that we don't have an alternative. We need to access overseas markets. It will get us a better price, and it will give these overseas markets a diversified source of supply, and they won't just be held hostage by the Americans. So it's in everybody's interest to diversify, to access higher prices. And to do that, you have to build capacity, and you have to do it preferably on both coasts. But there's any number of proposals out there on both coasts. Businesses have indicated that they're willing to, even if some politicians think that there isn't a business case, as long as businesses are willing to take the risk and absorb the losses, I don't know why it's any business of anybody except them. And as long as firms are willing to take that risk, I think it's in our national interest to diversify our markets and get higher prices.
Very well said. Philip Cross, Senior Fellow with the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, author of this great piece in the Financial Post that we were talking about here, the title of which is "The Figures Show Canada Needs More LNG Projects." Philip, good to talk to you. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.
All right, that does it for us for today. Since he mentioned Stephen Maher's book, I got to do another shameless plug of Pierre Poilievre, A Political Life, available now on Amazon, Indigo, and wherever fine books are sold. And I should probably tell you as well, I have an event coming up next week in Winnipeg, my first ever foray into Manitoba. So take from that what you will. I've never been there until now, but this is what's bringing me. And that is going to be on June 20th, 2024 at noon. It's a lunchtime event at the Downtown Convention Center. And if you want some details about that, you can go to conservativeclubwpg.ca, conservativeclubwpg.ca. And that's going to be a lot of fun. I've already had a couple of people email me to tell me they will be there. So see you soon, but also I'll be back tomorrow with more of Canada's most irreverent talk show. Thank you, God bless, and good day to you all.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.